As products get better and better each year, each promising a new set of breakthrough features, there's something to be said about the journey through a product line, within a product line. Last year, the Latitude 7340 was my first glimpse into the solid, no-fuss philosophy of Dell's approach to business laptops. Fast forward to my 9440 review just last month, and we witnessed a leap towards the high-end or even the overbuilt hardware. And that led us here, eagerly anticipating what awaits us with the 9450, the 7450 coming soon, and now to review the 7440. Before we jump into the 50 series, let's anchor ourselves in the present with the 7440 series. This machine is the very definition of staple good, unassuming, but it's proficient at the core tasks. It might not have the same flair of the 9440 that we just reviewed, but it nails the essentials so well that it gets me really excited to see what its successor will have in store in the 7450. Let's dive into the substance behind the Latitude 7440's understated elegance and where we just want maybe a bit more. Let's start with the design. Unlike the 9440, the Latitude 7440 adopts more, let's say, understated charm. Like its little brother that I reviewed last year, the materials are quite relatively pedestrian, being a combination of plastic and magnesium. Now, while it's generally not going to turn heads at a coffee shop, it also won't strain your shoulders carrying it around in a backpack because it is significantly more light. But what really stands out about this design over the more expensive 9440 is the fact that it still retains legacy ports, including HDMI, 2 USB Type-A ports, a headphone jack, in addition to the 2 USB-C Thunderbolt 4 ports. Despite those added ports, the 7440 is still quite thin, and I would frankly prefer this over having to carry around a dongle in order to connect peripherals like a mouse and keyboard. And speaking of connections, it's not about USBs and HDMIs, it's also about connecting with you, too. If you're enjoying the deep dive into the world of business tech, we'd love to earn your subscription. If you find our videos insightful, join the InnoIso community as a free way to support the channel and stay connected for the journey through Dell's evolving Latitude line and much more. Now, back to the 7440. Now, as for the webcam, there's none of that magical automatic snapping shutter like we had on the 9440. It's just a classic little shutter, a manual shutter that allows you to cover it up. I appreciate it for its straightforwardness since it doesn't make little noises when it opens and closes the same. My model relies just on Windows Flow facial recognition and no fingerprint sensor, at least in this model. It is an optional upgrade. Now, I prefer having both personally, but I gotta say, the facial recognition on these devices is incredibly fast and a lot more consistent than what I've experienced on most of my Surface laptops. This model has the higher end display at 2560 by 1600 or 2K, along with 400 nits max brightness, which is, in my mind, a sweet spot for business use. It's not the micro OLED some might yearn for or that we had in the 9440, but it's just as sharp and bright as I need out of a business machine. And remember, the 9440 had that glossy display while sharper, and it became less usable in bright light when I was using dark backgrounds. The 7440 with a matte finish instead performs much better under direct lighting in my experience, although you do have to put up with unfortunate plastic bezels around the sides. The display can also come in 1900 by 1200, which is kind of 1080p stretched downwards, and I think for most business laptops that should be sufficient. This one does have touchscreen, which I do appreciate touchscreens on any of my laptops, so it was nice to have. As for under the hood, this review model boasts an i5 13th generation paired with 16 gigs of RAM and 500 gig SSD. It's noticeably slower than an i7 and a 9440, but it does handle just about every office task well. Once I started to throw more and more of it, especially when I was on video calls, the performance started to lag down a little bit and the fan started to get a little bit louder. Dell offers the i7 processor as an option on this and up to 32 gigs of RAM, which could be a better fit if you're a power user like me. Maybe it's a trade-off with the size, but it feels like, unfortunately, the days of upgrading RAM in business laptops like this are gone. So you're basically stuck with whatever you buy for your team. That said, at least the SSD slot is still accessible and very easily upgradable. One major drawback from its big brother, though, I noticed is This has significantly less battery life than the 9440 in my testing, which seems to average somewhere in the ballpark around 5 to 6 hours of use before I needed to find an outlet. This is more in line with expectations for most business laptops I've used, some a little bit better even. So don't expect to get a full workday out of it unless you have a plug nearby. If you're docked in, then generally you'll just be okay. Now, one thing I did prefer with this device over the 9440 is the keyboard. Keys are all in the right spot as you'd expect, and the amount of additional travel that you get with these spaced out keys and the comfort is quite rewarding. Now, it's not as fancy looking as the non-islanded keys of the 9440, but in my mind, the spacing is very, very comfortable, and it feels a lot more like my older 5400 Latitude from a few years back. Me, personally, I also prefer this trackpad with a physical click over the capacitive trackpad on the 9440. Now, generally that's driven by the fact that I have relatively large hands, and I had a tendency to accidentally overlap the trackpad on the 9440, which was substantially larger, and the result was I'd accidentally misclick while resting my palm on the keyboard. Like the 9440, the 7440 comes with Dell's suite of business software, including the Dell Optimizer software, which unfortunately doesn't feel quite optimized for me. My complaints about this software are the same as on other Dell devices, but generally the features of the Dell Optimizer software are pretty cool, and it's some very, very interesting additions that you don't have with native Windows. It's just, I wish it was a little bit more fluid. Overall, my experience is that while the 9440 was the most striking business laptop that I've used in a long time and offered some very compelling reasons to want a business laptop, the 7440 is a very consistent, dependable device that perfectly satisfies my needs for a business laptop. I love the fact that it's so lightweight, especially with a full 14-inch screen. It might sound a bit silly, but in my mind, the world would be a better place if all companies use this as their primary devices, but that's not, unfortunately, the way that things work. In fact, the 7440 in my mind is the consistent standard that most business laptops should try to reach. Now, while the battery life and the performance for my model wasn't quite outstanding, I thought the 7440 felt just great and fluid and nice to use, and it was, in my mind, a lot less stuffy than the 9440. Dell's 50 series are just around the corner, and I'm very pumped to see what AI and other features Dell has in store. Now, if you're also excited and you want to hear what we have to say, then I'd love to hear what you'd like me to focus on and any sort of questions that you have for the 50 series. And as we get our hands on them, we'll be sure to keep you updated. Thank you for watching InnoIso. I hope you liked this review of the Dell Latitude 7440. If you did, be sure to get subscribed, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.